Good afternoon, and welcome to our podcast series titled Past, Present, and Future, Perspectives on Mental Health in the Black Community. This initiative will consist of a series of podcasts, forums, and healing circles over a 6-month period that seek to expose the negative stigma associated with mental health in the Black community, encourage open and honest discussions among men, women, youth, queer and trans people, and provide tangible solutions toward healing and recovery. I want to take this moment now to show our appreciation and thanks to the City of Toronto for their support towards this worthwhile endeavor. I am your host, Richard Lambie, and it is a pleasure to welcome all of you to this very important discussion. Today's podcast is titled Empowerment, Black Mental Health at the Intersection of the Black Canadian LGBTQ2+ community. Now, we take this moment to recognize that Pride Month is here and now in the month of June. Pride Month is a time when we celebrate the diversity of the LGBTQ+ communities while acknowledging their history, the hardships they've endured, and the progress that has been made. Now, this podcast will discuss the importance of empowering the Black, queer, and trans community while addressing the high rates of mental health challenges that at some times, but not always, have been linked to higher suicide rates. The podcast will also illustrate how challenges to mental health in the Black community are rooted in barriers to treatment and care, which are further linked to mistrust of the medical community, societal injustices, and poor to no health insurance coverage. Lastly, the podcast will provide some mental health and wellness resources and services that cater specifically to the Black, queer, and trans community and allow the broader Black community to become allies with the queer and trans community and to understand and address the social determinants of health that are most important for Black, queer, and trans individuals. While the intention of this podcast is to create an environment of knowledge sharing, positive affirmations, and space for joy, some content may be emotionally triggering and of a sensitive nature. This podcast will feature content related to issues related to mental health in the Black community, which may be emotionally triggering for some. If you or someone you know is triggered by this content or is experiencing a mental health concern, including having thoughts of suicide, support is available. Immediate support is accessible by calling 211 or 1-855-310-2673. You can speak with a crisis worker at any time. Children and youth can also access telephone support 24/7 by contacting the Black Youth Helpline at 416-285-9944. For immediate emergency support, please call 911. All services are free and can be accessed confidentially. Joining me in this discussion now is Tatiana Ferguson, co-founder of the Black Queer Youth Collective, and Tele Kapirwa. I'm going to do that one again. Start again. Joining me in this discussion is Tatiana Ferguson, co-founder of the Black Queer Youth Collective, and Tele Kapkirwak, program coordinator of the Domino Project. I want to thank both of you for joining us in this discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Again, we appreciate your time. So I want to start with you, Tatiana. If you could please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about the Black Queer Youth Collective that you've co-founded, and why do you feel this work is so important?
Sure. So, hi everyone, Tatiana Ferguson here. As Rich mentioned, I'm co-founder of the Black Queer Youth Collective. I'm also an equity and inclusion specialist whose work focuses primarily on diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice issues. I have done some research in relation to LGBTQ health and trans health, I worked on a project looking at the experiences of African, Caribbean, and Black trans women in pursuit of relationships and whilst dating in the Queer and Trans Research Lab at the Bowman Center for Sexual Diversity Studies. And I'm also a co-investigator on Trans Pulse Canada. But for today, I'll be focusing specifically on my work with the Black Queer Youth Collective, which is a grassroots group dedicated to providing opportunities and support Black, queer, and trans individuals in the Toronto and Greater Toronto area. Our primary demographic is Black LGBTQ between the ages of 16 and 29. However, under certain circumstances, we often offer our services to folks under the age of 16 and over the age of 29. So in terms of that question, why is it so important for us to do this work, or how our work is framed in the community? The BQIC has a very interesting origin story. The Domino Project, actually, which Telly is working on currently, was our first pilot project. And that project was designed in response to a need that was identified in 2018. We saw that, myself and a few of the other co-founders, so that there was a big gap in youth services, and we wanted to respond to that gap. So we organized a community, we hosted a few consultations, and we got some insights from the community in terms of what they were needing, what was missing, and how programs could be better responsive to their needs. And out of those consultations came the BQIC, and we submitted a proposal and was successful in our acquisition, and which led to us launching the Domino Project. Since then, the BQIC has launched several other projects, including our Domino Table Talk, which we are also kind of running during this transitional post-COVID period, as well as our BQIC COVID-19 Assistance Project, which is our first emergency relief project. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm happy to be here with Telly, who's stepping into that project coordinator role for the Domino Project. Telly, take it away, introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tatiana. But yes, hello, my name is Telly Kapkirwak. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the project coordinator for the Domino Project under the Black Queer Youth Collective. And yeah, like Tatiana mentioned, it's an initiative that was run before and it's coming back again. So we're offering drop-in programming for Black LGBTQ plus youth in Toronto and providing a safe space for Black, queer, and trans youth to learn and build positive interpersonal skills and participating in experiential learning opportunities in partnership with the Parkdale Queen West Community Health Center. So we are doing monthly themed workshops, presentations, community outings, covering a wide range of topics like gender identity, gender expression, coming out, sexual health, food and nutrition, mental health is a really big one, fitness and healthcare, management, saving, as well as helping unpack stereotypes and misconceptions around Black, queer, and trans youth.
All right, thank you very much to both of you for giving such a fulsome response. So I want to get started into this. You both sort of touched on it already. Can you give our audience a sense of what the challenges that are being faced right now in the Black, queer, and trans community, and also particularly the youth? I think that's an important intersection that we should look at. And how are these challenges affecting the mental health of these individuals? And if we could start with Telly, if you could let us know first.
Yeah, absolutely. Just as far as doing peer-to-peer support that we do, what we hear from our youth are a lot of challenges around employment, education, and housing. And those are really big factors just around how that affects your mental health, just on the day-to-day basis of somebody, a Black, queer, and trans person who is, trying to live their life in Toronto. They have a lot of struggles securing employment, for example, and specifically speaking about trans people, for example. having to go through this name change procedure, this transitional period in their life. It makes it extremely complicated just as far as like documentation and being able to, yeah, secure and maintain employment with an employer that you feel like can understand your queer and trans experience and make sure that it's not such a struggle to be able to go to work every day and be able to do the basic things like, yeah, pay the bills that you need, pay rent, manage to eat. And yeah, and housing as well, which is a topic that we've touched on a lot, just around, yeah, family acceptance. If you come out to your family and you find yourself suddenly without a place to stay, it's a really huge struggle to be able to find stability and housing. So looking towards any organizations that may help with these kinds of things, it's definitely a really big one. And that really affects mental health, just as far as like not being able to have that stability of knowing where you're going to stay for the night or how you're going to, yeah, secure employment and get your next paycheck. So that really, really affects our youth, and they obviously seek out mental health care to be able to talk through these kinds of things, and ends up, yeah, talking a lot about the anxiety, the depression that this puts them through. So there's definitely a really big need in community for mental health support for our Black, queer, and trans youth.
Okay, and thank you so much for breaking that down. Now, Tatiana, in preparation for this podcast, you did mention some specific areas that intersect with what Tele had just said that I think are extremely important, you know, because I think we all know that issues of employment, education, housing, being able to pay bills, I mean, that's not unique to the queer and trans community, but there are some specific factors that you and I spoke about before, Tatiana, that exacerbate things even more. So please share with us.
Yeah, and thank you, Telly, for providing those three big areas. One thing I want to do before I guess I add to the conversation is share that in 2020, the BQIC, specifically I should say the Domino Project, had conducted a community needs assessment. And in that community needs assessment, we engaged 94 Black, queer, and trans youth in Ontario. A vast majority of folks were residing in Toronto, but we didn't want to limit the study to just Ontario because we know folks are in transit and Toronto is not the most affordable city to live. But out of that community needs assessment, we found that 1/5, so 1 in 5 persons who had participated in the study was either unemployed or earning less than $15,000 a year, which is very much below the low income threshold. In addition to that, 53% of the youth who participated in the study were actually in receipt of social assistance, so OW or ODSP, Ontario Works or Ontario Disability Support Program, which means that a vast majority of folks are really experiencing financial hardship. And income, while there's income from social assistance, very much the bare minimum, which can make day-to-day living a bit challenging for these individuals. As you've mentioned, Richard, I don't think that employment is an issue that's unique to Black, queer, and trans youth. However, I would say that there are many factors that create barriers to employment. As Tele mentioned, for trans folks, how you show up to work, the name that you use when you are applying for a job, as well as your gender recognition when you are employed. What spaces are actually safe for, trans, non-binary folks to have meaningful employment. And these can create barriers because these are kind of the emotional and mental turmoils that folks go through when applying for jobs, when going on interviews, and even whilst employed, interacting with fellow coworkers and customers. So I would say those are some of the context in terms of some of those larger issues that affect Black, queer, and trans youth. Another one, however, is the need for healthy relationships. In our community needs assessment, youth had an opportunity to identify several areas that were of importance to them, or that they were interested in a program responding to. And beyond mental health, beyond anti-Black racism and anti-racism, anti-oppression, was dating and relationships. So at the very top of the list that youth were most interested in was dating and relationships, forming relationships in community, having healthy connections in community. So yeah, I would say another big challenge for Black, queer, and trans youth is really connecting with like-minded individuals. And the BQIC, specifically our Domino Project, our drop-in group, has created a space for folks to do so pre-COVID. But Telly, I see you have something to add?
Yeah, I think you made a really great point just as far as, because yeah, I do remember from our community needs assessment, there was that really strong desire to talk about dating and relationships. And it kind of connects to what I said earlier about maybe not being able to have that support from your biological family. So there's a lot of these bonds that are built of like chosen family and friends and community you decide to surround yourself with. So that becomes a really important part of, yeah, not only mental health, but just life in the day-to-day living of it. And I feel like it's also important to mention the intersections of identity here, just as far as like Blackness and like queerness and transness. And in some people's experiences, like they feel like they turn to their Black community and they don't feel supported in their queerness and transness just because of homophobia and transphobia that are experienced there. And they turn to the queer community, but yeah, feel unsupported in their racial identity because they find a lot of people in the queer community have a very like white lens that they perceive queerness with. So just helping find that, yeah, intersection of identity and like relationships that you can build to be able to speak with these people openly and honestly about your experiences that you're going through.
What is the role of we're going to get a little bit dark here. What is the role of violence, child abuse, neglect? Where is that fitting in to this process? I mean, these things as well are happening outside of the Black, queer, and trans community, but how is it unique to this group?
Yeah, I'd want to start with this in response to this question, because so Telly, like I said, mentioned three very poignant issues: the issue of employment, the issue of education, and also housing. So how is it connected to some of the experiences that Black, queer, and trans youth have? It's connected because, one, if a person is rejected at a very young age, they can become homeless. That's where the issue of housing comes up. If they experience, bullying in school, they may decide not to go to school. They may not have completed high school. And actually, our community needs assessment also had inquired about that. Looking at, based on the results that we did collect, 20%, so that's like 1 in 5. 1 in 5 persons that participated in the project didn't complete high school. And this is likely due to bullying. This is likely due to homophobia, biphobia, transphobia within the school systems, or maybe them having to move around if they are involved in child protective services or child welfare. All of these factors create a mental toll on folks, and it's connected to, their educational journey. Of course, employment, like I mentioned earlier, for trans folks is how they show up. Some folks, if they didn't complete high school, they would not be able to qualify for jobs that they may be interested in pursuing. And we now see this interconnectivity of oppression and that folks would have due to rejection and lack of acceptance at a very young age.
Okay, well understood. Was there anything else you wanted to add to that, Tele?
Yeah, I feel like that's the salient point. And I feel like, as far as the topic of mental health, that definitely affects people further down the road. Like Tatiana said, experiencing this rejection at a young age from several places, from your family, from your school, maybe from your friend group, saying homophobic or transphobic things, yeah, informs ideas of identity moving forward. So, attachment styles, trauma responses, and also just growing up in youth, seeing the depiction of queer and trans people in media and how people talk about queer and trans people really informs how a young queer and trans person might think about themselves and what ideas they internalize as they get older. And yeah, it ends up showing up in different places throughout their lives, which, yeah, drives them to seek support just as far as their mental health.
Okay, so I know one of the things that I've spoken about in previous podcasts is the issue of access. And we know that in the broader Black community, there are a number of factors that limit access. One is a familiarity, just feeling comfortable being able to share these mental health concerns with somebody that they don't know and or may not be able to relate to their situation, being Black or from continental Africa or of African descent, West Indian descent. And in addition to that, the just the stigma that's associated. Now, we've spoken about the stigma related to Black, queer, and trans people, trans youth. How is all of that affecting access? In this report that you mentioned, one of the things you discussed with me earlier is that 41% of Black, queer, and trans youth have experienced an adverse childhood experience. So that would normally, therefore, lead to seeking support, but that's not happening. And it seems like maybe there is a desire for that to happen. But what are some of the reasons why it's not happening as much as it should? And I'll start with Tatiana.
Sure. So I think there's a lot of, how can I put this? I think when we think about responding to the mental health needs of the community, it's not a one size fit all approach. So there are some folks who may need some support, overcoming some of the intergenerational trauma and the violence they would have experienced by family. So some of the family trauma. There are some folks who have other mental health needs, and I would say maybe it had spiraled a bit. So it's not a one size fit all approach when we think about barriers and access to mental health supports. I know for us, we talk about mental health a lot because we know that it affects how folks feel when they are in a program, when they are in a group, when they are amongst people. As Tele mentioned, there are sometimes triggers that folks may have due to some of the experiences that they're dealing with or trying to cope with. So with accessing mental health, we often talk about culturally responsive services, but the question often lies is like, whose culture are we referring to? Because we work with folks from, the diversity of Blackness that intersects with queerness, whether that's from the Caribbean, second generation, third generation, et cetera, Canadians, as well as African migrants. And there isn't a singular approach that we can take. So I think that one of the biggest challenges with responding to folks, particularly youth mental health, is really understanding what works for that demographic of youth. Not everyone might be interested in clinical psychology or like having to do a clinical assessment. And our Black Mental Health Week Photo Voice project, we actually asked the question, well, what are youth doing to support their mental health? Information about that project can be found on our website. But we see that folks are using a very hybrid and blended model. Some folks were interested in restoration, so like resting and reflective exercises like meditation and yoga. And other folks were more into like physical stuff, like walking, taking, exercising and walking, like doing some vigorous activity. And there was also the need for nourishment in terms of what folks need. Sometimes bonding over a meal, eating, are all ways that are outside of the clinical models that prove to be effective in youth supporting their mental health. So I think one of the biggest barriers is really understanding what do a client, because we can't say youth, that would be a generalization, but what do a specific client need, and how can us as service providers respond specifically to that client's need? But Tele, do you have any thought? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Richard.
No, continue, please.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Richard, just as far as like access. And I feel like there's three things that probably come up for me. And first of all is just, yeah, one of the first big hurdles that I feel like folks have to cross is also acknowledging the fact that you need help. So that's a big hurdle for a lot of people, just because in the experience of like the youth that I've talked to, and even personally, like there's a big lack of encouragement as far as like mental health and talking about your feelings and going to see a counselor or therapist, because there's that fear, there's that stigma that like, yeah, if your mental health isn't at its best, then it's not something you want to openly share. So trying to break that down a little bit and just like encourage people that like this is something good and normal, and yeah, being able to deconstruct a bit of that like stigma and guilt and shame surrounding accessing mental health services, as well as like, and the second step, when people do decide to access these mental health services because they're going through a lot in their lives, yeah, accessing culturally competent mental health care. So experiences of like going to see a therapist who's going to understand your Blackness, who's going to understand your queerness, understand your transness. And that's been a barrier as well, just as far as a lack of, yeah, Black, queer, and trans therapists in the city. There just doesn't seem to be, yeah, enough access to be able to serve the community that's asking for it, that's demanding these services, that needs these services. And some of that, I feel like another barrier that comes up against it, because Tatiana and I have both spoken to Black mental health professionals, Black queer and Black trans mental health professionals who are, yeah, who echo the same kinds of things that we say as far as there's not enough of us. We're trying to serve this community, but there's so many people that need help, and there's not enough of us. So the wait lists end up being extremely long. And there's just this gap of service that they're trying to fill. And some of that I feel like does have to do with like education, just as far as like young Black, queer, and trans people who are just coming up, graduating high school, thinking about post-secondary education. But some of the things that they faced before post-secondary might prevent them from being able to feel like they can do those kinds of things. So there was a study released by York University a couple of years ago about Black students' experiences in the TDSB, and how a lot of Black students, like it's a bit different now since they're working on breaking down this streaming that they used to do in the schools, just as far as like applied versus academic. So a lot of Black students would be discouraged from going to the academic route, which would lead them to university and lead them to be able to maybe pursue a psychology degree where they would become a counselor or a therapist. A lot of Black students got discouraged and were, yeah, told by maybe teachers and counselors that maybe higher education or university wasn't for them. In a disproportionate amount, and not to say that university or higher education is for everybody, and that's the be all end all of like being successful. It's not. But students who might have done who might have fit in really well in that kind of environment and felt that that was a calling of theirs might have gotten discouraged by, yeah, the system that they're participating in that tells Black students that, they can't do this, they can't do that. So I feel like that also contributes a little bit to the lack of, yeah, diverse and culturally competent mental health care for Black, queer, and trans folks.
Those are very important points. And I want to thank you. Again, we're speaking with Tatiana Ferguson and Tele Kapkirwak. And we're having a discussion on Black mental health and its effects on the Black, trans, and queer youth community. So you started touching on this, both of you did, in terms of what resources are available for this group. You did say that it was limited. Are there other options available? So, for example, if somebody is not motivated or they may have been discouraged, a Black, queer, trans person from getting into mental health services, are there programs available for training or sensitization of current and active mental health professionals, even Black mental health professionals, that they can become more familiar with the Black, queer, and trans community, and again, intersecting with youth?
Yeah, I think this is a very tricky question because, like Kelly spoke to, there isn't a lot of Black professionals working in psychology. Due to our partnership with Parkdale Queen West Community Health Center, we do make referrals to counselors at that health center should a youth desire clinical support. However, as Telly also mentioned, there's often a wait list, and a lot of the issues that need to be unpacked cannot be unpacked in a few sessions. We're talking trauma that could have started from as young as 8, 9 years old, when folks first start to realize their gender or express their sexuality in ways that differs from the larger societal expectations. So to unpack all of that, trauma and violence and hardships and rejection that folks would have experienced in 4 or 5 sessions is a bit unrealistic. So for us, we know that that's a big challenge in terms of facilitating access to professional counseling services here in Toronto and the Greater Toronto area. With that said, though, what we have been doing through our work is creating a space and opening the discussion. Since resuming our drop-in group, we've talked about coming out. We're actually we've watched a few films. Last week we watched a film, and this week we're watching another one. But after watching the film, there were discussions that came up around folks' experiences coming out. What are the risks? The risks that coming out really bring to queer folks. While it is, it's Pride Month and it's a celebration of LGBTQ identities, as Black, queer, and trans folks, we know that there's a real risk that folks often have to deal with, and the support is not always there. So for us, what we use is a peer support model, in that if there are folks who are going through something and they, to avoid them feeling isolated whilst awaiting professional support, we do provide that one-on-one support, as well as we facilitate group discussions to ensure folks don't feel like, whatever they're going through is a singular or unique experience. There have been lots of conversations that we talk about in terms of our upbringings and how we were socialized and how that differs. Actually, at one of our groups, I think there were folks from essentially all continents. There was someone from America who's now living in Canada. Myself, originally from the Bahamas, so the Caribbean, now in Canada. Tele, and like we were all talking about how we were positioned in different places, but now we're all here in Canada, and what connects us is, this Black queer experience, but also how our experiences have been quite similar despite being from different parts of the world, essentially. But yeah, I think in terms of organizations that are providing training, there are organizations like Rainbow Health, but it's not for us as a group that's, Black led, also that has queer and trans representation in leadership roles. It's not just about facilitating access to a counselor because that's who's qualified. Going back to that cultural competency piece, a lot of the youth that we work with, they want Black, queer, and trans counselors. They want folks who embody their identities because it allows for conversations to flow better. They don't feel like they have to explain or pander to a counselor because of their inefficiency or lack of awareness in relation to issues involving race or sexual identity.
Understood. Anything you wanted to add with that, Tele?
Yeah, just as far as echoing some of the points that Tatiana made, just around, yeah, I guess service providers around the city also recognize that there is this huge gap in services, specifically for Black, queer, and trans youth. So there are initiatives that are just being started all around the city, and we've collaborated with, a couple of them. Folks like, Women's Health and Women's Hands, the Black Research Network, the LGBTQ Youth Line, who are all doing work to try their best to fill this gap in services that's so, desperately needed, especially for such an underserved community. So there is research ongoing, there's work being put in. And yeah, in the meantime, I feel like the work that we've been doing at the BQYC has also been trying and succeeding to support Black queer youth in their mental health journeys. And I know just recently we had our Black Mental Health Week project. We had a photo voice project that touched on, Black, queer, and trans youth self-care practices and being able to reflect on those and be able to emphasize those, just because, you need to find a way to take care of your mental health if you can't access these services. If you're on a wait list for a really long time, we want to be able to provide alternatives and ways of people to be able to engage with community, be able to share their experiences and feel, like they're not alone, like they're supported, and also remind these folks to, reflect on what they do to take care of themselves in an effort to be able to have this sense of community care and be able to take care of each other.
Thank you very much, Tele. Again, we're speaking with Tele Kapkirwak from the Domino Project, along with Tatiana Ferguson from the Black Queer Youth Collective. Please look online for both of these organizations if you're in need, if you want to learn more or if you're in need of any services. So with the remaining time that we have in this podcast, like we do in most of our podcasts and we'll be doing later on in a broader scale, let's look forward. We talked about the issues that are being faced right now. We talked about the challenges, the lack of capacity through the system. Let's start to lay out the framework going forward, what's needed, what type of political assistance, support do you need to move this forward? What kind of economic support may be needed? Those tying into social programs. What type of expansion can be done that can be assisted? You also spoke about research. What can the academic community do to assist in moving this movement forward, in expanding accessibility to the Black, queer, and trans youth community? Then I apologize. Let me start with Tatiana.
Oh, I was hoping you was gonna say Tele. Okay, so
Sorry.
I can start if you'd like.
I feel like because I do share a lot of recommendations, so okay, maybe you can
Mhm.
start. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I can go ahead and start. Yeah, as far as like research, it's really exciting for me, just because personally I have a background in neuroscience and human biology research, which is where I got my degree. And there's a lot of really exciting research going on right now. And I feel like what's really important about that is gathering race-based data. Because a lot of what happened in studies before is that they would not gather race-based specific information. So learning about the experiences of like Black, queer, and trans people and the gaps in service, because they have a really big repository of research, but a lot of it is, yeah, not race-based and very white. So being able to gather this information on Black, queer, and trans experiences really helps inform policy moving forward, and being able to bring this data to the table and tell them these are the facts of what's going on, and be able to hopefully build some more progressive policy that really helps focus on Black, queer, and trans communities. And yeah, also helping support the Black, queer, and trans folks who are already in maybe the post-secondary system, who are trying to get their degree in psychology and mental health and counseling. Because from what I've heard from the Black, queer, and trans mental health specialists that I've talked about, they're also facing a lot of, yeah, racism, homophobia, transphobia within these systems. So being able to make that process easier for them to become mental health professionals who can start working in community and help them fill this need that's there. But they're also coming up against, decades and decades of tradition of this is how things were always done. So being able to start to incorporate new policies and new ways of working inside these institutions that can help support the Black, queer, and trans people inside of it, because a lot of what has been seen in the past is really quick turnover. These folks want to be able to support the community, so they enter these programs, they enter these institutions thinking, I'm going to do my best, but they face a lot of pushback and a lot of struggle. So hopefully making that process a little bit easier for them so that they can be able to complete whatever they need to and be able to support folks on the other side. So as far as policy, also just supporting the existing institutions and like programs and service providers that provide mental health services specifically for queer, Black, and trans youth, being able to continue to fund those programs, to be able to support them in hiring more staff and being able to support those staff. Because from our experience, the folks who are there now are overwhelmed with the amount of work they want to do. So just being able to, support them in that way and build capacity to include more people.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tele. I also have a few suggestions in terms of what can be done to move this work forward. So I'll start with embrace innovation. Whilst what we have been doing has proved to be effective, it's important that we revisit our working models. We try new things. As we've mentioned during this podcast today, March 3rd through 7th, which was Black Mental Health Week, we engaged the community to understand what are things folks are doing to take care of their own mental health. And out of that, we prepared an online, gallery, an exhibit for folks to reflect and hopefully to inspire other folks to think about how they can support their own mental health outside of the clinical models, because we know there are challenges there. So embracing innovation is something that I think needs to be done. How that Photo Voice project has also helped us to start to think about unique ways we can be working. So for us, in the evaluation of our Domino project in its earlier phase, there were suggestions around more themed events and inviting more youth and more promotion and engaging more people in the work. So that's something we're striving to do, whilst also considering what folks are interested in. And we did that Photo Voice project. We likely will probably be doing another Photo Voice project to engage community in a very fun way in discussions around mental health. And using what we saw in that project, we are informing our program as to date. So we are going to be hosting a bonfire to have some intergenerational conversations with Black, queer, and trans elders. We are planning on doing something around fitness and movement. We had a meditation session just so that folks can be grounded in this process. And if they are new to meditation, it's something they can see whether or not they like. And if they were already doing it, it's just something to do in community. Based on other discussions we've been having, as Tele mentioned, they have a science background. I myself have a business background. We're very interested, or we're having discussions around getting more Black, queer, and trans folks into STEM careers. Like, how do we ensure that folks do see themselves in science, tech, engineering, and maths? Outside of some of the more applied courses, how do we ensure that, folks can see themselves working in science and research labs or developing new technologies? Solar energy, Elon Musk has made billions of dollars with Tesla. So, and that I'm sure, those of us that are from, places that have a lot of natural resources, we have tried to harness those natural resources, but there hasn't been the investments from the governments in the innovation that's needed. So I think that that's a call to action. Governments can invest in pathways for youth to be involved in STEM and thereby helping to contribute to the economic ecosystem here in Canada, but also globally. In our program, there's been a lot of discussions around budgeting and money management. So I think there's a need for more financial literacy programs, and not in ways that you need to make more money, because for some folks, that's not easy, especially if they have limited education and they're not in the best mental headspace to pursue gainful employment. But helping folks to better use the resources that they do have is, I think, something that we would love to engage folks doing, work in the financial sector in our program. So, help you to make smarter decisions with their money. And I don't work for Scotia, but I think Scotia has a slogan, "You're richer than you think." And I love that, because definitely I've been trying to shift this narrative that our experiences just have to be rooted in adversity. Another thing that I myself am interested in, I also, as mentioned, I do a lot of work around research. So I think a think tank where folks can pitch their projects and have real investments in those projects would be a unique take on this work. Also, we are asking, to sustain this work, most organizations, as mentioned, we are a small grassroots group, we require funding to be able to sustain our work, to scale our work. In scaling our work, we would love to expand. In that community needs assessment, we actually also heard that, I think, sorry, I need to pull it up, but I think there's about roughly 50% of the participants in our project actually resided, no, more than 50% actually, hold on one second, let me pull it up. 28% of the 94 respondents in that community needs assessment resides in Toronto. So that means 72% actually resides outside of Toronto. There's a big gap in terms of where folks are living versus where services are located. This pandemic has taught us that, one, you can offer programs virtually, which has been a blessing, but also how do we ensure that there's still that connections and community building. The BQIC would love to expand. There are folks in our team, on our advisory team, who was at one point in the East, West, North, and South. So we were just scattered throughout the city, but connecting virtually, which was good during the pandemic. But it's important that folks have physical spaces to access for programs. So I think moving forward, that's another area. It does require a more hefty investment. But I think the government should really be investing in programs that have proved to be effective, as well as investing in the ideas that youth are putting forward. Like, because I'm a big proponent of investing in, like, innovation and thinking creatively. So those are my suggestions in terms of moving forward. What can be done to, if not improve Black, queer, and trans youth mental health, better help us to respond to the needs of the community. And with that said, thank you again, Richard. And yeah, I look forward to your closing.
Well, thank you very much, Tatiana, and thank you, Tele, for your insightful thoughts. I hope our audience has benefited from this discussion. I know I have. We covered a lot of different topics and areas here. And I always like looking forward at the end so that we can see where we want to go. It's not enough to look and see where we are or where we have been. We must certainly also show a vision and a way for the future and make sure that we're always looking that way. I mean, even if we don't get there, as long as we are looking forward, we at least know that we're going in a forward direction and we're not becoming stagnant. So with that, I want to thank Tatiana Ferguson, co-founder of the Black Queer Youth Collective. And I want to thank Tele Kapkirwak, a part of the Domino Collective. This has been absolutely wonderful. It's been insightful. And I want to encourage the audience, go online, check out the Black Queer Youth Collective, check out the Domino Project, give your support, share your ideas, get the word out. Let's work together. Let's see how we can provide support for all those who need it. So again, thank you very much. And we will always be reaching out with further podcasts, healing circles, and focus groups during this awareness campaign on Black mental health. Take care, everyone.